Case number 1. Rex Andrew Heuermann. There is a specific kind of dread that arrives not with a scream, but with silence. The silence of a man who goes home every evening, sits at the dinner table, kisses his wife, and tucks his children into bed, while somewhere at that exact same moment, a family across town waits for a daughter who will never return. That dread has a name. That name is Rex Heuermann. What makes his story so deeply unsettling is not just the scale of what he allegedly did. It is how completely ordinary he appeared to everyone who ever knew him. He was the man who designed buildings for a living. He was the neighbor who waved from the driveway. He was the commuter on the Long Island Railroad, briefcase in hand, heading into Manhattan every morning, like thousands of other men in thousands of other suits. And for nearly 2 decades, investigators believe he was also something else entirely. Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Amber Lynn Costello, 4 young women whose lives would become forever linked, not by choice, but by circumstance and tragedy. All 4 worked as escorts, advertising their services through Craigslist. All 4 were petite in stature. All 4 vanished from the streets of Long Island between 2007 and 2010. Their families reported them missing. Their photographs circulated. And then, in the winter of 2010, their remains were discovered along a desolate stretch of Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. They were found buried in burlap sacks, just a quarter-mile apart from one another. The precision of the disposal sites suggested something calculated, something methodical. But the story does not end with those 4 women. 3 more victims would eventually be connected to the same suspect: Jessica Taylor, Sandra Costilla, Valerie Mack. Their cases stretched the timeline backward, reaching all the way to 1993. Some of their remains had been found years earlier, in different counties, filed away as cold cases that seemed to have no connection to anything else, until investigators began looking closer. 7 women, 7 families permanently altered, 7 lives taken across a span of 17 years. Rex Andrew Heuermann was born on September 13, 1963, and grew up in Nassau County, Long Island, New York, a place he would never truly leave. He built a career as an architect, eventually operating his own firm, RH Consultants and Associates, out of Midtown Manhattan. By all outward appearances, his life was structured, professional, and unremarkable. He was tall, well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, and physically imposing in a way that stood out in every courtroom photograph. He had a wife and 2 children, and a home in the quiet village of Massapequa Park. His neighbors knew him as polite. His colleagues knew him as competent. His family knew him as a husband and a father who came home every night. For decades, that was the only version of Rex Heuermann the world knew. What investigators would later uncover told a very different story. Among the files on his computer, prosecutors said they found what they described as a detailed personal blueprint, checklists written by Heuermann himself, purportedly containing reminders to limit sound, clean surfaces, and destroy physical evidence. The documents, if accurate, suggested not impulse, but deliberate long-term planning, not rage, but methodology, not a man who lost control, but a man who had spent years refining his control over every detail. He was an architect in more ways than one. The story of how that version of Rex Heuermann crumbled begins not with him, but with a young woman named Shannon Gilbert. In May of 2010, Gilbert, a 24-year-old woman who advertised escort services online, disappeared after fleeing from a client's home in Oak Beach, Long Island. She placed a frantic call to 911, told the dispatchers someone was chasing her, and then vanished into the night. Police launched a search. What they found along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach would rewrite the history of Long Island crime. Within weeks, investigators discovered the remains of 4 women buried in burlap sacks just a quarter-mile apart along the same remote stretch of shoreline. They would eventually be identified as Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, and Amber Lynn Costello. The nation was riveted. The killer, quickly nicknamed the Long Island serial killer, was a ghost. For over a decade, It remained one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. Families lived in suspension. Detectives came and went. The beach became a symbol of an answer no one could find. Then, in 2022, something shifted. A joint law enforcement task force revisited the evidence with fresh eyes and new technology. A witness tip from 2010 had always flagged a Chevrolet Avalanche seen near the area where Amber Costello was last spotted. When investigators traced that vehicle, it led them to Rex Heuermann. From that point forward, they began watching him closely. Surveillance teams followed him through the streets of Manhattan. They monitored his movements, his phone, his patterns. And then, in a moment that would later make headlines around the world, investigators retrieved a discarded pizza crust from Heuermann's trash. The DNA extracted from that crust matched the DNA profile built from hair evidence found on multiple victims. The evidence also included phone records showing that Heuermann made hundreds of calls to the numbers of the victims in the period leading up to their disappearances. His phone data placed him in the areas where they were last seen. The hair evidence was perhaps the most striking forensic element of all. Stray hairs without roots, difficult to extract DNA from using conventional methods, were found on 6 of the 7 victims. Prosecutors used a California laboratory called Othram Forensics, specialists in whole genome sequencing, to derive nuclear DNA from those rootless hairs. The results pointed to Heuermann. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested in Midtown Manhattan, just steps away from the office where he had worked for years. He was 62 years old. He was charged initially with the first-degree and second-degree murder of 3 women from the Gilgo 4. Within months, the charges expanded. By January of 2024, he was also charged with the killing of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. By June of 2024, prosecutors added the names of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Costilla. Costilla's case proved particularly significant. She was a 28-year-old woman from Trinidad and Tobago whose remains had been found by hunters in North Sea, Long Island, back in November of 1993. Her inclusion stretched the alleged timeline of Heuermann's crimes back more than a decade further than anyone had anticipated. In December of 2024, a 7th charge was added, the 2000 murder of Valerie Mack, whose partial remains had been found in Manorville, New York in 2000. 7 women. A timeline stretching from 1993 to 2010, 17 years of alleged targeting, abduction, and disposal across Long Island. The defense fought to exclude the DNA evidence. The judge allowed it. Heuermann's legal team challenged the DNA methodology, the chain of evidence, and the structure of the case. They argued the charges should be separated into multiple trials. The court disagreed on every front. His wife filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. His family, who had reportedly kept a piece of physical evidence that investigators later recovered, became peripheral figures in a case that grew larger with every passing month. Through it all, Heuermann maintained his innocence, but the evidence continued to accumulate. Phone records, GPS data, digital blueprints found on his devices, DNA profiles matched through cutting-edge genomic sequencing, witness accounts of a Chevrolet Avalanche in the vicinity of multiple disappearances. The prosecution built its case, piece by piece, layer by layer. Not a crime of passion, not a moment of rage, but a pattern of behavior sustained across nearly 2 decades. As of March of 2026, Rex Heuermann, held without bail at Suffolk County Jail in Riverhead since his arrest, is expected to enter a guilty plea on April 8 before Judge Timothy Mazzei. Sources close to the case confirmed that both his family and the victims' families have been notified of the decision. He faces life in prison without the possibility of parole. 7 women, 7 families permanently altered, and a man who spent decades designing structures for a living, while prosecutors allege dismantling human lives with equal precision. The sentencing hearing will bring a form of closure that has been delayed for far too long. For the families of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Amber Lynn Costello, Jessica Taylor, Sandra Costilla, and Valerie Mack, the guilty plea will mark the end of a legal process that has spanned years. But it will not bring back what was taken. It will not restore the lives cut short. It will not erase the decades of waiting, of wondering, of grief compounded by uncertainty. What it will do is provide an answer, a name, a face, a conclusion to a question that haunted Long Island for nearly 30 years. The Gilgo Beach case is not just the story of Rex Heuermann. It is the story of what can remain hidden in plain sight for nearly 3 decades, and of the families who never stopped waiting for the truth to emerge from that cold stretch of sand. It is also the story of 7 women who deserved better, who deserved to be seen as more than statistics, more than case numbers, more than burlap-wrapped remains along a desolate highway. They were daughters, they were sisters, they were human beings whose lives mattered. But Rex Heuermann is not the only name on this list, and Long Island is not the only place where ordinary surfaces concealed something monstrous underneath. Our next case takes us to the desert heat of Phoenix, Arizona, where a young man with a famous civil rights leader for a grandfather would spend 3 weeks in the winter of 2017 writing his own, very different legacy. Case number 2. Cleophus Emmanuel Cookie, Jr. Imagine writing a letter to a judge from behind bars, accused of 8 murders, and your defense is 4 words. I am a music artist. That is exactly what Cleophus Emmanuel Cookie Jr. did in January of 2020. Scrawling his protest in a handwritten note, insisting the charges against him were nothing more than false accusations and that the world had misunderstood him. He was not a killer. He was a creative soul. He had dreams. He had lyrics. What he also had, unbeknownst to the people of Phoenix, was a trail of blood stretching across 3 weeks in the autumn and winter of 2017. A trail that a jury would spend 8 years waiting to evaluate. Parker Smith, 21 years old. Andrew Remillard, 27. Celiardis Richards, 31. Jesus Raleigh, 25. Latori Beckford, 29. Christopher Cameron, 21. Maria Graciela Villanueva, 43. Renee Louisa Clardy Cookie, 56. Edward Nunn, 54. 9 names, 9 lives, 8 confirmed murders that prosecutors would eventually tie to a single individual across a span of just 21 days. Some victims had known Cookie personally. Christopher Cameron was a young father with an 11-month-old son and another child on the way. Maria Villanueva was a mother of 2 daughters, abducted and found the next morning in a Phoenix alley, partially undressed. After being sexually assaulted, Renee Clardy Cookie was Cookie's own mother. Edward Nunn was his stepfather. Both were found shot at close range in their living room, with the murder weapon sitting on the sofa and the keys to one of the victim's vehicles on the table. Others were strangers who simply crossed Cookie's path at the wrong moment. There was no single grand motive offered for all the killings. That absence of a clear why made the case feel even more destabilizing. Cleophus Emmanuel Cookie Jr. was born on March 25, 1982 in Arizona. He is the grandson of Roy L. Cookie, a noted civil rights leader in Tucson, a lineage of advocacy and community service that makes what Cleophus eventually became all the more disquieting. How does a family tree rooted in the fight for human dignity produce a branch so corroded? That is not a question the courts can answer. But it is the kind of question that lingers long after the verdict is read. His first serious collision with the law came in 2001 when he was 19 years old. He participated in a robbery at a topless bar, a crime that turned lethal when the establishment's manager shot and killed one of Cookie's accomplices in self-defense. Under Arizona's felony murder rule, Cookie bore legal responsibility for that death simply by virtue of his presence. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sent to prison. He served his time. He was released in July of 2017, 4 months. That is how long the gap was between his release from prison and the night everything changed. Back in Phoenix, Cookie found work at a furniture store and picked up side jobs as a laborer. He became part of a motorcycle club. With his charisma, his tattoos, and his easy way with people, he attracted a circle of admirers, particularly among teenage girls and young women. He had several girlfriends. One lived with him. He was the kind of man who made people feel seen. That quality, investigators would come to believe, was also the very thing that made him so dangerous to the young women crossing his path. Because when someone believes they can make you feel special, when they know exactly how to read vulnerability and respond to it, they also know how to exploit it. Jesus Ra'ale was the brother of Cookie's ex-girlfriend, Liliana Vasquez. The two had broken up the night before Raleigh was found shot dead in Avondale. Police linked Cookie to the killing, but prosecutors ultimately declined to bring formal charges in that case. The pattern was beginning to form: personal grievances, opportunistic violence, and a willingness to cross lines that most people never approach. On the night of November 27, 2017, Parker Smith and Andrew Remillard were found shot to death inside a vehicle sitting in a Phoenix parking lot. The motive was not clear. No one had sounded a citywide alarm. There was no public announcement that a dangerous individual might be at large. Life in the Phoenix metropolitan area went on as usual, until it did not. 5 days later, on December 2nd, a security guard named Celiardis Richards was walking to his girlfriend's apartment when he was fatally shot. Prosecutors would later establish that Cookie physically fought with Richards before taking his gun, a 9mm pistol, and his necklace. That gun would resurface. It would become a thread that stitched together multiple murders. Then, on December 11th, Jesus Raleigh was found shot dead. Then came December 13th, LaTorri Beckford, shot dead. December 15th, Christopher Cameron, a young father, also shot dead. December 16th, Maria Villanueva, abducted, her body found the next morning. And then came December 17th, 2017. Officers responded to a report of gunshots in an apartment. The man who answered the door was Cleophus Cookie Jr. himself. He told police he had cut his hand. He said he was the only one home. Officers noticed what they described as a large amount of blood. When they attempted to detain him, Cookie threatened to slit an officer's throat. When investigators entered the apartment, they found two people who were very much not alive: his mother and his stepfather. Both had been shot at close range. After his arrest in early 2018, the full weight of what had unfolded began to settle over the valley. 8 lives had been taken across just 21 days. Some victims had known Cookie personally. Others were strangers who simply crossed his path at the wrong moment. Prosecutors described the pattern plainly. He targeted people when they were at their most exposed and unguarded. On the living room sofa, police found Richard's gun. On the table, the keys to Maria Villanueva's vehicle. Around Cookie's neck, Richard's stolen necklace. He was wearing the trophy of one of his victims when they came for him. The investigation revealed GPS records placing Cookie at or near locations where the murders occurred. Ballistic data linked bullets from 2 9mm firearms to the crime scenes. There were no eyewitnesses to most of the killings, but the physical evidence formed a web that prosecutors believed was impossible to escape. Cookie maintained his innocence. He called himself an artist. His trial, repeatedly postponed due to the global pandemic, finally began on May 5, 2025, nearly 8 years after the killings. Over months of proceedings before a jury of 12 with 10 alternates, prosecutors presented forensic evidence, including ballistic data linking bullets from 2 9mm firearms to the crime scenes, along with GPS records placing Cookie at or near locations where the murders occurred. The defense challenged the reliability of the forensic evidence and pointed to the absence of a stated motive across all the cases. Why would someone kill their own mother and stepfather in the same spree as strangers? Why would someone take a security guard's gun and then wear his necklace to the door when police arrived? The prosecution's answer was simple: because he could. Because he believed he would not be caught. Because the pattern was not about motive in the traditional sense. It was about power, control, and opportunity. Cookie's DNA was recovered from Maria Villanueva's body. His possession of Richard's gun and necklace was undisputed. The ballistics evidence was clear. The GPS data was damning. The jury was unmoved by the defense's arguments. On September 25, 2025, Cleophus Emmanuel Cookie Jr. was found guilty on all 8 counts of first-degree murder, along with kidnapping, armed robbery, and attempted sexual assault charges. When the verdicts were read aloud in the Maricopa County Superior Court, Cookie looked down at the defense table and said nothing. On December 18, 2025, Judge Mark Brain sentenced him to death for 6 of the 8 murders. The jury deadlocked on the sentences for the killings of his mother and stepfather. He was also ordered to serve more than 9 additional years for the non-capital charges. Maricopa County Attorney Rachel Mitchell addressed the press with a statement that cut through all the legal language. The case, she said, was a reminder of exactly why the death penalty exists. The families of the victims delivered impact statements that painted a picture of lives interrupted, futures stolen, children who would grow up without fathers, daughters who would never again speak to their mothers. Christopher Cameron's family spoke of an 11-month-old boy who would never know his father. Maria Villanueva's daughters spoke of a woman who had worked hard, loved fiercely, and deserved to come home that night. A man who called himself a music artist. A man who wore his victim's necklace to the door when police came knocking. A man whose grandfather spent his life fighting for the dignity of human beings, while his grandson spent 3 weeks in the winter of 2017 taking that dignity away. One life at a time. As of the time of this writing, Cookie remains in custody in Arizona, awaiting execution. His appeals are just beginning. The families of his victims continue to wait for a finality that may be years away. From the desert heat of Phoenix, we travel now to the long, flat highways of Texas, to a stretch of Interstate 45 that locals simply call the Corridor, a road that connects cities and carries commerce. But for decades, it also carried something else. A predator who understood that distance creates anonymity, and that the space between one state and another can feel like a place where consequences do not exist. Case number 3. William Lewis Reece. Picture a stretch of American highway that cuts through swampland and refinery smoke, connecting Galveston to Houston and continuing north all the way to Oklahoma. Locals who grew up along Interstate 45 know it for its long, flat monotony, the kind of road that makes the mind drift. But for law enforcement officers who worked its corridor for decades, that same road tells a very different story. It is a trail of missing women and unanswered questions that stretches back further than most people care to count. And at the center of that trail, driving a pickup truck back and forth between states, was a man named William Lewis Reece, a horse farmer's son from Oklahoma who spent the summer of 1997 taking lives and then calmly went back to his routines, carrying those secrets for nearly 20 years before anyone could prove a thing. Laura Smither was 12 years old when she left her home in Friendswood, Texas, to go for an early morning jog in her neighborhood in April of 1997. She never came back. Her parents launched a frantic search. Her body was found weeks later in a pond. Tiffany Johnston was 19, a newlywed who had recently married, and was described by her mother as someone who lit up every room. She stopped at the Sunshine Car Wash in Bethany, Oklahoma in July of 1997. She was abducted from the parking lot. Her body was found the following day in a remote field west of Yukon. Kelly Cox was 20 years old, a student at the University of North Texas in Denton. She disappeared in July of 1997 after stopping at a gas station. She was never seen again, not until 2016, when her remains were finally recovered from a rice field in Brazoria County. Jessica Kane was 17. Driving home to Galveston County after a theater performance in August of 1997 when she simply vanished from the highway. Her car was found abandoned on the side of Interstate 45. There was no trace of her, not until investigators, guided by a confession, found her remains on a property in southeast Houston. 4 young women, 4 families destroyed. One summer. William Lewis Reece was born on July 1, 1959 in Oklahoma, the child of a struggling rural family. He was one of 13 siblings raised on a farm near Yukon. Periods of financial hardship meant he spent time in foster care as well. He left school after the 9th grade to work, learning horseshoeing, a trade that would follow him for life. He married in 1979 after his girlfriend became pregnant. But the marriage did not last, and neither did his freedom. In 1986, Reece was convicted of raping 2 women and sentenced to prison in Oklahoma. He served nearly a decade. When he was released in the mid-90s, he relocated to Houston, Texas, regained his driver's license, and began moving between states for work, hauling horses, driving trucks, and blending into the background of blue-collar America. He was tall, physically strong, and to those who encountered him briefly, utterly unremarkable. What no one knew was what he carried with him, not just tools and equipment, but patterns, urges, and a willingness to act on them that would turn the summer of 1997 into one of the most destructive periods in the history of the Interstate 45 corridor. Then came 1997, a year that would quietly become one of the most destructive in the history of the Interstate 45 corridor. In May of that year, 19-year-old Sandra Sapah stopped at a convenience store off Interstate 45 in Webster, Texas. A man in a white pickup truck told her she had a flat tire. When she walked to her car to check, he forced her inside his vehicle. She was driven down the highway, assaulted, and then, in a moment of desperate courage, jumped from the moving truck and survived. She reported the attack. Reece was arrested in October of that year and convicted of kidnapping. He was sentenced to 60 years in Texas, but investigators did not yet connect him to any of the murders. And what happened in the months between Sapah's escape and his eventual arrest, Reece kept going. In April of 1997, 12-year-old Laura Smither left her home in Friendswood, Texas, to go for an early morning jog. She never came back. Her body was found weeks later in a pond. At the time, there were no leads pointing to Reece, and the case went cold. 2 months later, in May, Sandra Sapah survived her encounter with Reece. She jumped from his truck. She lived. She testified. But the other women who crossed his path that summer were not as fortunate. In July of 1997, 20-year-old Kelly Cox disappeared after stopping at a gas station. That same month, 19-year-old Tiffany Johnston stopped at the Sunshine Car Wash in Bethany, Oklahoma. She was abducted from the parking lot. Her body was found the following day in a remote field. And in August, 17-year-old Jessica Kane was driving home to Galveston County after a theater performance when she simply vanished from the highway. Her car was found abandoned on the side of Interstate 45. 4 young women, 4 families destroyed, 1 summer. And for almost 2 decades, William Reece sat in a Texas prison on his kidnapping conviction, denying everything. What finally broke the silence was DNA. In 2015, advances in forensic technology allowed investigators to test a sample collected from Tiffany Johnston's case against a national database. The result came back pointing to Reece. Texas Ranger James Holland traveled to the prison to interview him. The 2 men met repeatedly over the following months, and Holland, a skilled interrogator, built a slow, deliberate rapport with Reece. He brought him food. He made promises about helicopter rides and creature comforts. He offered written assurances from certain district attorneys that the death penalty would not be sought in Texas. And, piece by piece, Reece began to talk. He confessed to all 4 killings. He described each encounter in specific, clinical detail, the confrontations, the locations, the methods. He led investigators to a rice field in Brazoria County where the remains of Kelly Cox were buried. He directed them to a property in southeast Houston where Jessica Kane had been hidden for nearly 20 years. The families who had spent 2 decades not knowing finally had answers, but answers arrived alongside a grief that had never truly left. In May of 2021, after a 9-day trial in Oklahoma County, a jury found William Reece guilty of the first-degree murder of Tiffany Johnston. The deliberations took less than 2 hours. He was sentenced to death. Tiffany's husband delivered a victim impact statement in which he described the life they would never have together, the children they would never raise, the years simply gone. Her mother told the court plainly and without ambiguity that she believed Reece should die. In June of 2022, Reece was returned to Texas, where he stood before judges in Galveston and Brazoria counties and pleaded guilty to the murders of Laura Smither, Jessica Kane, and Kelly Cox. He received 3 consecutive life sentences. Laura Smither's mother, Gay, delivered a statement that stopped the courtroom. She said she had chosen forgiveness, not for Reece's sake, but because she refused to spend the rest of her life locked inside her own pain. She said she hoped to meet him one day and talk about her faith. It was one of the most striking acts of grace anyone in that room had ever witnessed. As of January of 2026, William Lewis Reece, now 66 years old, has been transferred from Texas back to Oklahoma, where he currently awaits execution at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. His state appeals were denied in 2025, and a direct appeal is now pending before the United States Supreme Court. No execution date has been set while those appeals remain active. The families of Laura Smither, Tiffany Johnston, Kelly Cox, and Jessica Kane continue to live with the weight of what was taken from them. Some have chosen forgiveness, others have chosen justice in its most final form, but all of them, in their own way, have had to reckon with the reality that the man who destroyed their lives spent 2 decades moving freely between Texas and Oklahoma, believing the distance was wide enough to keep his secrets safe. 4 names, 4 families, 1 highway, and a man who believed the distance between Oklahoma and Texas was wide enough to keep his secrets safe forever. The road had other plans: the persistence of investigators, the advancement of forensic science, and the courage of Sandra Sapaw, who survived and testified, ultimately brought those secrets into the light. From the highways of Texas and Oklahoma, we travel now to the desert outskirts of El Paso, to a city that in 1987 found itself gripped by a terror it had never experienced before and, until the Walmart mass shooting decades later, would not experience again at that scale. 9 girls and young women, all disappeared within months of one another, and somewhere in the same city, a man with long hair and a warm smile was moving through bars and parking lots and convenience stores. Charming, approachable, and utterly unsuspected. Case number 4. David Leonard Wood. There is a particular kind of terror that does not arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, through a missing daughter, a phone that goes unanswered, a door that never opens, and then another one, and then another. What do you do when your city begins to swallow its young women whole, and no one seems to know why? That was the question that gripped northeast El Paso through the spring and summer of 1987 as 9 girls and young women, some as young as 13, vanished from their neighborhoods within a few months of one another, and somewhere in the same city. A tattooed man with long hair and a warm smile was moving through bars and parking lots and convenience stores. Charming, approachable, and utterly unsuspected. 14-year-old Marjorie Knox vanished on Valentine's Day of 1987. 13-year-old Melissa Alcanese disappeared 3 weeks later. Then, 15-year-old Desiree Wheatley. Then 17-year-old Angelica Frausto. Then 20-year-old Karen Baker. Then 24-year-old Rosa Maria Casio. Then 23-year-old Ivy Susanna Williams. Then 19-year-old Cheryl Vasquez Dismukes. Then 14-year-old Dawn Marie Smith. 9 girls and young women, ages 13 to 24, all from northeast El Paso, all disappeared between February and August of 1987. The city was shaken in a way that northeast El Paso had never experienced before, and, as it turned out, would not experience again at that scale until the Walmart mass shooting decades later. Over the following months, the remains of 6 of the missing young women were found in shallow graves scattered across the desert in northeast El Paso, in an area that would later become Painted Dunes Golf Course. The other 3, Marjorie Knox, Melissa Alcanitz, and Cheryl Vasquez Dismukes, were never found. Their families are still waiting. David Leonard Wood was born on June 20, 1957, in San Angelo, Texas, the second of 4 children. His father, Leo, eventually moved the family to El Paso, where he held an executive position with the El Paso Electric Company. From the outside, it was a comfortable, even prosperous upbringing, but inside the family home, there was real turbulence. His mother, Betty, had begun exhibiting signs of severe mental illness, and the household was marked by frequent conflict. Wood did not finish high school. He dropped out in the 9th grade and eventually worked as an auto mechanic. What came next, before anyone had reason to connect him to any disappearances, was already a deeply troubling record. In the early 1980s, Wood was convicted on multiple rape charges. He served time, was paroled, served more time, and was released again in January of 1987. He had been free for less than a month before the disappearances began. Back in El Paso, Wood found work at a furniture store and picked up side jobs as a laborer. He became part of a motorcycle club. With his charisma, his tattoos, and his easy way with people, he attracted a circle of admirers, particularly among teenage girls and young women. He had several girlfriends. One lived with him. He was the kind of man who made people feel seen. That quality, investigators would come to believe, was also the very thing that made him so dangerous. Between February and August of 1987, 9 women and girls ranging in age from 13 to 24 disappeared from the northeast El Paso area. The pattern was unmistakable. Young women, similar age range, similar neighborhoods, all vanishing within a compressed time frame. Fear had settled into northeast El Paso at a cellular level. People stopped letting children play outside after dark. Neighbors who had known each other for years now hesitated at their own front doors. The investigation eventually zeroed in on Wood. Witnesses placed him in the company of at least one of the victims in the days before her disappearance. A blood-stained knife found among his personal belongings was believed by prosecutors to be connected to one of the deaths. And then there were the jailhouse informants. 2 men, Randy Wells and James Carl Sweeney, who would later testify that Wood had confessed to being the desert killer while behind bars. The disappearances began on Valentine's Day of 1987, when 14-year-old Marjorie Knox vanished. 3 weeks later, 13-year-old Melissa Alcanese disappeared. Then 15-year-old Desiree Wheatley. Then 17-year-old Angelica Frausto. By the time summer arrived, the count had risen to 9. And the city of El Paso was gripped by a fear that no one could quite articulate, but everyone could feel. Over the following months, the remains of 6 of the missing young women were found in shallow graves scattered across the desert in northeast El Paso. The locations were remote. The burials were shallow. The evidence at the scenes was minimal. The other 3 victims were never found. Their families have spent decades waiting for answers that have never come. Prosecutors would later describe the pattern as one of targeting young women who were vulnerable, who could be approached, who might trust someone who seemed friendly, who seemed safe. The investigation was massive. Police worked the case for years, following leads, interviewing witnesses, and building a circumstantial case against David Wood. The prosecution's case was, by their own admission, circumstantial. There was no confession on record. No physical evidence directly tied Wood to the grave sites at the time of trial, but witnesses placed him in the company of at least one victim before she disappeared. A blood-stained knife was found among his belongings, and 2 jailhouse informants testified that Wood had confessed to being the desert killer. Wood was indicted in 1990 for capital murder, and his trial was moved to Dallas in 1992 because of the sheer volume of pre-trial publicity in El Paso. The jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. He arrived on Texas death row on November 10, 1992, and from that day forward, he said the same thing. He did not do it. What followed was one of the longest-running legal battles in Texas capital case history. For more than 3 decades, Wood's attorneys filed appeal after appeal. They argued intellectual disability, a claim that won a stay in 2009, just 1 day before his scheduled execution, but was ultimately rejected in 2014. They sought DNA testing on evidence recovered from the victims, a battle that produced a partial but telling result. One of 3 blood samples tested in 2010 excluded Wood as the contributor. The court said that single result was insufficient to change the outcome of the trial. Further testing was denied. An execution date was set for March 13, 2025. As the date approached, the appeals intensified. Wood's defense attorneys raised 8 separate claims in a final habeas corpus petition, including allegations that jailhouse informants had been handed investigative files by detectives to help them fabricate testimony, that evidence had been destroyed, and that prosecutors had withheld material at trial. They pointed to an affidavit filed in January 2025 by Ramona Desmukes, which raised new questions about the testimony of a woman Wood had also been convicted of assaulting around the same period. 2 days before the scheduled execution, on March 11, 2025. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals voted 6-2 to grant an indefinite stay. The court did not explain which of Wood's 8 claims it found worthy of further review. It simply stopped the clock. On July 30, 2025, the same court sent Wood's case back to the trial court and ordered a full review of his claims of innocence and his allegations of ineffective representation at the 1992 trial. Retired Texas Judge Dick Alcala was appointed to oversee the review. As of the time of this writing, no new execution date has been set. Wood remains on death row at the Allen B. Polunsky unit in West Livingston, Texas, still insisting, as he has for nearly 4 decades, that he is not the Desert Killer. Whether the courts eventually agree or disagree, 6 young women, Desiree Wheatley, Karen Baker, Angelica Frausto, Dawn Marie Smith, Rosa Maria Casio, and Ivy Susanna Williams, were buried in desert sand before anyone came looking. Their families have spent decades waiting for a finality that keeps slipping just out of reach. That waiting, perhaps more than anything else in this case, is its own particular kind of consequence. From the desert outskirts of El Paso, we travel now to the streets of Chicago, to a city that has seen its share of violence, but rarely of this particular kind. Because what do you do when the person committing serial murders is not a hardened adult, but a teenager, someone barely old enough to drive, someone who still wore the face of adolescence? Case number 5, Antonio Reyes. What would it take for you to look at a teenager, someone barely old enough to drive, someone who still wore the face of adolescence, and see the architecture of something far darker underneath? What would it take to believe that at 16 years old, a person could already be methodically ending lives, not out of desperation or rage, but from something that felt to him almost pleasurable? That is the question Chicago found itself asking when the full picture of Antonio Reyes finally came into the light. Reyes was 21 years old when authorities formally labeled him a serial killer in February of 2025. But the crimes themselves were not new. They had been folded into the city's grief for years. A body in an alley, a man shot crossing a street with a soft drink in his hand, a young UPS driver who had simply been waiting to pick up a friend, 6 people, 9 months, 1 teenager. Francisco Magana was 31 years old. He had just bought a drink from a gas station and was crossing the street in the 2600 block of West 59th Street when he was attacked in March of 2020. There was no history between him and his killer. There was no argument that had escalated. No transaction gone wrong. Prosecutors say he was frustrated with members of his gang, the Latin Kings, believing they were not doing enough, and went out looking for rival gang members to confront. Magana appears to have simply been there. Justin Gonzalez was 20 years old, standing on 59th Street when a car pulled alongside him. Damian Duran was 16 years old, found shot dead in an alley. A boy who, as his mother, Marlene Rangel, would later reveal, had considered Reyes a friend. That detail carries its own particular weight, because here is a truth about this case that resists easy categorization. Cook County State's Attorney Eileen O'Neill Burke told reporters that none of these people had ever met Antonio Reyes before, in reference to most of the victims, yet at least one, Duran, had been close to him. Reyes, it seemed, was not constrained by the categories that tend to define most crimes of this nature. Strangers and friends alike were within reach. Antonio Reyes was 16 years old when the killings began in March of 2020. By the time authorities formally labeled him a serial killer in February of 2025, he was 21. Chicago police described his digital footprint as substantial enough to help link him to the various shootings. His social media presence proved significant, but the full weight of those connections took years to construct. During that time, Reyes sat in juvenile detention and later jail, apparently unbothered by the possibility of consequences still forming around him. In fact, the behavior did not stop with his initial arrest. Soon after landing in juvenile detention, Reyes placed a call to his 18-year-old friend, George Reyes, no relation, and allegedly told him to take care of their mutual friend, Sebastian Serrano, who was expected to testify against him. Serrano was later lured from his home and shot dead. George Reyes and a second associate, Andreas Gilliard, were both ultimately convicted in that killing. Antonio Reyes himself faces no charges in connection with Serrano's death, but the alleged orchestration of it from inside a detention facility tells a story about the kind of thinking at work. While in custody on the original charge, Reyes was also charged with attempted murder after he allegedly stabbed his cellmate with a construction nail in 2022. The walls of confinement, it appeared, had not changed the calculation. The killings occurred in the Gage Park, Brighton Park, and Clearing neighborhoods on the southwest side. And in 3 of them, shots were fired from a passing car. The victims ranged in age and background. There was a father who had been shopping for a puppy with his children. There was Justin Gonzalez, simply standing on a corner. There was Damian Duran, found in an alley. When the additional 5 murder charges were formally filed in February of 2025, prosecutors offered details in court that went beyond the facts of the shootings themselves. Prosecutors disclosed that Reyes allegedly told associates he derived a form of physical excitement from the act of firing at people and that he liked to return to the scenes of his crimes, film them, and deliberately disrupt memorials left for the victims. It was a disclosure that shifted the conversation from crime to psychology, from what happened to what kind of person allows it to happen. The killings began in March of 2020 when Reyes was just 16. According to prosecutors, his first target was 31-year-old Francisco Magana, who had just bought a drink from a gas station and was crossing the street when he was attacked. What followed over the next 9 months was a pattern that investigators would later describe as one of the most disturbing they had encountered. 3 of the shootings involved shots fired from a passing car. The victims ranged in age and background. A father shopping for a puppy with his children. 20-year-old Justin Gonzalez, standing on 59th Street. 16-year-old Damian Duran, found shot dead in an alley. Reyes was first arrested in late 2020 in connection with the killing of a 26-year-old man. A .40 caliber handgun recovered by investigators that year was later tied to shell casings found at multiple crime scenes. Reyes was first arrested in late 2020 in connection with the killing of a 26-year-old man. A .40 caliber handgun recovered by investigators that year was later tied to shell casings found at multiple crime scenes. His social media presence also proved significant. Chicago police described his digital footprint as substantial enough to help link him to the various shootings. But the full weight of those connections took years to construct. When the additional 5 murder charges were formally filed in February of 2025, prosecutors offered details that went beyond the facts of the shootings themselves. They disclosed that Reyes allegedly told associates he derived a form of physical excitement from the act of firing at people, that he liked to return to the scenes of his crimes, film them, and deliberately disrupt memorials left for the victims. Reyes stood in court, flanked by 4 Cook County Sheriff's deputies, his arms and face covered in tattoos, known on the street by the name Red Rum. The word murder written in reverse. He greeted the judge politely and said nothing further as the prosecution laid out its account. Cook County State's Attorney Burke called it sad to think about a 17-year-old committing serial murders over the course of 9 months. Asking aloud how many people were taken, it is a question that reaches further than the courtroom, because the victims of Antonio Reyes were not taken by a force of nature or an institution or a system. They were taken by a teenager on the southwest side of Chicago who, by every account, knew exactly what he was doing and chose to keep doing it. As of the time of this writing, Antonio Reyes has pleaded not guilty to all charges and awaits trial. The trial is currently scheduled for approximately 2027. The legal process moves forward slowly, as it tends to do, but the facts, as prosecutors have laid them out, the ballistics, the social media trail, the admissions allegedly made to associates, point toward a reckoning that has been a long time coming. For the families who spent years wondering whether anyone would ever answer for what was taken from them, the trial will be the culmination of a wait that has stretched across half a decade. Francisco Magana, heading home from a gas station. Damian Duran, 16 years old, found in an alley. Justin Gonzalez. Standing on a corner. A father who had been shopping for a puppy with his kids. The sister of Francisco Magana spoke outside court after one of Reyes's hearings, saying the prolonged legal process had brought her family constant flashbacks. "My mom is suffering a lot," she said. "The families of the other victims carry the same weight. There are people who commit terrible acts in moments of crisis, in circumstances that spiral beyond their control. And then there are cases like this one, where the timeline stretches across 9 months, where the choice to continue is made again and again, and where the boy committing the acts is young enough that the world had not yet finished asking what he might become." Antonio Reyes answered that question himself, and the southwest side of Chicago is still living with his answer. Our next case takes us to Massachusetts, to a story about what happens when society decides, consciously or not, that some lives simply matter less than others. Case number 6. Kevin Lino. When a fire disappears, no one files a missing persons report. When a voice goes quiet in a crowd that was never really listening, the silence barely registers. That is the quiet, devastating truth at the center of the Kevin Lino story. Not just the story of a man prosecutors now call a serial killer, but the story of what happens when society decides, consciously or not, that some lives simply matter less than others. 4 men are dead. The killings stretched across 4 years in 2 states. And yet, for more than a decade, not a single headline carried their names. The question worth sitting with before any of the facts are laid out is this: would it have taken 10 years to connect these dots if the victims had been anyone other than who they were? Gary Meanson was 54 years old. He lived in a transient encampment in Lowell, Massachusetts. He would light fires at night to stay warm. He was older and much smaller in stature than the man who would eventually kill him. Douglas Leon Clark was 30 years old. He was found on the banks of the Charles River in 2012. The manner of his death was recorded as a suspected accidental overdose. No foul play was noted. The case did not even register as a homicide for years. Normand Verrier was 45 years old. He was found near a dock at Paul Revere Park in the Charlestown neighborhood of Boston in 2012. He had been struck repeatedly and died 4 days later from his injuries. Jack Gilbert Berry was 36 years old. He was living in a transient camp under a bridge in Missoula, Montana in 2014. His body was found in a river 6 days after the attack. 4 men, all experiencing homelessness, all living on the margins of society, all dead, and for years, almost no one noticed. Kevin Lino was 38 years old when Middlesex County District Attorney Marion Ryan stood before cameras in August of 2025 and said 4 words that law enforcement reserves for only the most sobering cases. "Mr. Lino," she said, "is a serial killer, not a suspect, not a person of interest. A serial killer by the strict definition that the Department of Justice uses, requiring the unlawful taking of 2 or more lives in separate events." Lino had already been convicted of 2 such killings. The August arraignment added charges for 2 more, reaching back to crimes that had gone cold. One of them officially ruled an accidental death. The other assigned an undetermined manner of dying. Both cases, for years, generated almost no public attention. That, criminologists say, is not a coincidence. At the time of his first alleged killing, Lino was himself unhoused, living among the most economically and socially marginalized people in Massachusetts. In November of 2010, Lino and 54-year-old Gary Meanson were both living in a transient encampment in Lowell. Meanson, older and much smaller in stature than Lino, would light fires at night to stay warm. According to prosecutors, Lino viewed the fires as a risk, something that might draw unwanted attention to the camp. He reportedly warned Meanson to stop. Meanson did not. 2 years later, in the summer of 2012, Lino had relocated to Cambridge, where he was living in the vicinity of a homeless encampment near the Harvard Square subway stop. Prosecutors paint a picture of a man who had developed an intense hostility toward the substance users in the group, spending the better part of one particular day confronting and physically intimidating several of them in an effort to drive them out. When 30-year-old Douglas Leon Clark stood up to him, Prosecutors say Lino chose a different and far less detectable approach. What followed, prosecutors allege, was an act of terrifying disproportionality. Lino took an aluminum baseball bat and struck Meanson repeatedly until the older man was dead. When investigators looked at the case at the time, without a clear suspect, the trail went nowhere. The case went cold. 2 years later, when Douglas Leon Clark stood up to him in Cambridge, prosecutors say Lino allegedly offered Clark a dose of heroin, enough to cause a fatal overdose, a method sometimes referred to in legal documents as a hot shot. Clark's body was found on the banks of the Charles River. The manner of his death was recorded as a suspected accidental overdose. No foul play was noted. The case did not even register as a homicide for years. Lino was eventually arrested and convicted not for those 2 deaths, but for 2 others that investigators were able to build stronger cases around. In 2012, Normand Verrières, 45 years old, was found near a dock at Paul Revere Park in the Charlestown neighborhood of Boston. He had been struck repeatedly and died 4 days later from his injuries. Lino was convicted for that killing and received a 40-year prison sentence. While that case was still being processed, a second conviction followed, this one reaching across state lines. In 2014, 36-year-old Jack Gilbert Barry was living in a transient camp under a bridge in Missoula, Montana. Prosecutors established that Lino and an accomplice targeted Barry at that encampment. Barry's body was found in a river 6 days after the attack. For that killing, Lino received a life sentence running concurrently with his Massachusetts time. So by 2015, Kevin Lino was already behind bars, already convicted of 2 killings, already serving what amounted to the rest of his natural life behind walls. And the cases of Gary Meanson and Douglas Leon Clark, both dead, both originally written off as something other than murder, sat in filing cabinets undisturbed. What changed everything was information that surfaced in 2018, nearly 8 years after Meanson's death. The details of what exactly came to light have not been fully disclosed by prosecutors, but it was enough to reopen both cold cases and eventually to lead investigators to formally connect them to the man already sitting in a Massachusetts prison. By August of 2025, the Middlesex County District Attorney's Office had built a case sufficient to bring Lino before a judge on 2 new counts of first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty to both charges. A court date was scheduled for October 3 of 2025. As of the time of this writing, no further public updates from the District Attorney's Office have been released. Northeastern University criminologist James Allen Fox, co-author of Extreme Killing, Understanding Serial and Mass Murder, offered an observation that cuts to the heart of why this case resonates far beyond the courtroom. The reason most people had never heard of Kevin Lino before 2025, Fox said, comes down to who his victims were. When people experiencing homelessness go missing or turn up dead, the public response is fundamentally different. There is no vigil. There is no news cycle. There is often no missing persons report at all, because no one expected them to be anywhere specific to begin with. Lino's trial for the 2 new murder charges is pending. The legal process continues. The families of the victims, some of whom had lost touch with their loved ones long before they were killed, are left to reckon with losses that were never fully acknowledged. As of the time of this writing, Kevin Lino remains in a Massachusetts prison, serving life plus 40 years for the murders of Normand Verrières and Jack Gilbert Barry. He has pleaded not guilty to the murders of Gary Meanson and Douglas Leon Clark. Those cases are still making their way through the courts. Whether he is ultimately convicted of those additional charges or not, the fact remains that 4 men are dead, and for years, almost no one noticed. 4 men. 4 separate incidents. 2 states. 1 decade separating the first alleged killing from a district attorney finally using the words out loud. Gary Meanson was 54 years old, trying to stay warm by a fire. Douglas Leon Clark was 30 years old and chose the wrong moment to push back. Normand Verrières was 45. Jack Gilbert Barry was 36. Each of them was somebody's person. Each of them deserved to have their story told much sooner than this. From the margins of Massachusetts, we travel now to the Pacific Northwest, to Portland, Oregon, a city already stretched thin by its own visible crises. A city where women were disappearing. Then their bodies were appearing in places that felt almost deliberate in their remoteness. Abandoned barns, wooded hillsides, beneath bridges, inside culverts, and the city, already overwhelmed, barely registered the pattern until it was undeniable. Case number 7. Jesse Lee Calhoun. There is a particular kind of fear that settles over a city, not all at once, but gradually, like a fog that thickens before anyone thinks to check the weather. Portland, Oregon lived inside that feeling for months. Women were disappearing, then their bodies were appearing in places that felt almost deliberate in their remoteness. Abandoned barns, wooded hillsides, beneath bridges, inside culverts, and the city, already stretched thin by its own visible crises, barely registered the pattern until it was undeniable. This is the story of Jesse Lee Calhoun, a man who had been released from prison through an act of governmental mercy and who prosecutors now allege used that freedom to take 4 lives, perhaps 5. Kristen Smith was 22 years old when she died in November of 2022. Her mother, Melissa Smith, reported her missing from Gresham in December of that year. Kristen's remains were found in a wooded area off Southeast Deerdorf Road in Southeast Portland in February of 2023. At the time, her case sat without answers. One missing person among many in a region where disappearances did not always prompt the same urgency they might elsewhere. Joanna Speaks was 32 years old. Her body was found in an abandoned barn in Ridgefield, Washington in April of 2023. Charity Lynn Perry was 24 years old. She was found near Ainsworth State Park in East Multnomah County weeks later. Bridget Leanne Webster was 31 years old. She was discovered near Mill Creek in Polk County days after that. 3 women found within weeks of one another, in locations spread across a roughly 100-mile radius. Their bodies turned up in wooded areas, in a culvert, and under a bridge. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Jesse Lee Calhoun was born on March 19, 1985, and spent much of his adult life cycling in and out of the justice system. In 2019, he was convicted in Multnomah County Circuit Court for felony burglary and car theft and sentenced to 50 months in prison. What happened next is the detail that has haunted this case from the beginning. In 2021, then-Governor Kate Brown commuted his sentence along with those of 40 other inmates who had helped fight Oregon's devastating Labor Day wildfires. It was, on its face, a reasonable act of policy. People who put themselves in harm's way to protect others receiving credit for that service. Calhoun walked out of custody on July 22, 2021. The question that now hangs over that decision like smoke is this: what did freedom mean to Jesse Calhoun? Because according to prosecutors, the answer to that question is a timeline of loss that stretches across 5 months, 4 counties, and 2 states. The first victim prosecutors have connected to Calhoun was 22-year-old Kristen Smith, who died in November of 2022. Then, in the spring of 2023, the geography of grief expanded rapidly. In April of 2023, the body of Joanna Speaks was found in an abandoned barn in Ridgefield, Washington. Weeks later, Charity Lynn Perry was found near Ainsworth State Park. Days after that, Bridget Leanne Webster was discovered near Mill Creek in Polk County. 3 women found within weeks of one another in locations spread across a roughly 100-mile radius. And yet, for a time, authorities were cautious about confirming what many feared. In June of 2023, the Portland Police Bureau issued a statement saying it had no reason to believe the 6 cases are connected. That same month, a 5th woman, 22-year-old Ashley Reel, was found deceased in a wooded area in Clackamas County. The families were left waiting. In July of 2023, authorities named a person of interest in the killings, though Calhoun was not publicly identified until May of 2024. By then, he was already back in custody. He had been arrested in June of 2023 on unrelated parole violations. The legal machinery moved forward. On May 16, 2024, Calhoun was indicted on 3 counts of second-degree murder and 3 counts of second-degree abuse of a corpse. The charges covering the deaths of Speaks, Perry, and Webster. He entered not guilty pleas to all of them. For Kristen Smith's mother, that day was not relief. It was a doorway that remained closed. Melissa Smith later recalled the anguish of standing alongside the other families as indictments were announced. Knowing her daughter's name was not included, I cannot explain the agonizing pain I felt that day. She said. She kept pressing. She kept showing up. She kept asking that her daughter not be forgotten. Her persistence was rewarded, though that word feels almost inadequate given the circumstances. On August 5, 2025, a grand jury indicted Calhoun for the murder of Kristen Smith, adding 1 count each of second-degree murder and abuse of a corpse to an already weighty case. Calhoun now faces 4 counts of second-degree murder and 4 counts of abuse of a corpse in total. Standing at the podium outside the courthouse, Melissa Smith said, "I've always stayed hopeful that I would get justice for Kristen. I thank every single person who didn't give up on this case. There is still, as of this writing, 1 case unresolved. Ashley Reel's death remains under investigation, and Calhoun has been named a person of interest, though no charges have been filed in connection with her case." Multnomah County District Attorney Nathan Vasquez has stated that his office is actively working on it in partnership with Clackamas County. The mother of another victim, Diana Allen, spoke at the August press conference with words aimed at families still waiting. "Don't give up hope. It hurts so bad, but it's so precious. You cannot let it go." Calhoun's attorney, Cameron Taylor, issued a statement saying his client adamantly denies the allegations against him. A trial is currently scheduled for 2027. Until then, the families of Kristen Smith, Charity Perry, Joanna Speaks, Bridget Webster, and Ashley Reel carry the weight of unanswered questions and partially answered ones, waiting for a courtroom to do what no press conference ever fully can. What makes this case land differently, beyond the losses themselves, is what it forces us to reckon with about systems, about who gets mercy, about what gets overlooked, and about the women whose disappearances did not trigger alarms quickly enough. Jesse Calhoun was released as a reward for courage shown during a wildfire. Whatever happened after that release, 4 families are now left asking whether the calculation was ever fully made. As of the time of this writing, Calhoun remains in custody awaiting trial. The legal process continues. The families continue to wait. Kristen Smith, Joanna Speaks, Charity Lynn Perry, Bridget Leanne Webster, Ashley Reel. 5 names, 5 families, and a question that will not be answered until a jury delivers its verdict in 2027. From the fog of Portland, we travel now to the desert heat of Phoenix once more, to a different kind of terror, one that arrived not with a pattern that took years to detect, but with a burst of violence so concentrated, so indiscriminate, that it paralyzed an entire neighborhood in a matter of weeks. This is the story of the Maryvale serial shooter, a man who drove the streets by day as a city bus driver, and by night, prosecutors say, drove something darker through the west side of Phoenix. Case number 8. Aaron Juan Saucedo. Think about the most ordinary person you know, someone who shows up on time, drives the same route every day, lives quietly with family, gives no one a reason to look twice. Now ask yourself, how well do you truly know that person? Because the residents of Maryvale, a working class, predominantly Latino neighborhood on the west side of Phoenix, Arizona, thought they knew their city. They thought danger wore a recognizable face. They were wrong. And for nearly a full year, from the summer of 2015 to the summer of 2016, the streets they walked every night became a place where a man they had never met was watching, deciding, and acting, from behind the wheel of a black BMW, in the dark, with a semi-automatic pistol, and no discernible reason. Raul Romero was 61 years old and had a relationship with Saucedo's mother. He was found shot near his car in the gravel parking lot of his home on August 16, 2015. Jesse Olivas was 22 years old, standing outside a home on New Year's Day of 2016 when he was shot dead. Diego Verdugo Sanchez was 21 years old. He was visiting his pregnant fiancée's family when he was shot on April 1, 2016. Crystal Annette White was 55. She was found dead on April 19th. Horacio Peña was 32. Coming home from work when he was shot on June 3rd, Manuel Castro Garcia was just 19 years old. Shot outside his home on June 10th, and on June 12th, Stephanie Ellis, 33, her 12-year-old daughter Malia, and their friend Angela Linner, 31, were all shot outside their home. 3 women and a child in one night outside a house in West Phoenix. His name was Aaron Juan Saucedo. He was 23 years old at the time of his arrest. He was also, by day, a Phoenix City bus driver. Before working as a bus driver, Saucedo had attended a high school specializing in helping troubled youth and had held various jobs, including working as a laborer for a home remodeling company. He had no prior criminal record. He had no visible presence on social media. He lived with his mother. To anyone looking from the outside, there was simply nothing to see. That invisibility, as investigators would later acknowledge, was part of what made him so difficult to find. The victims were black women and young Hispanic men, and all but one were shot at random. Prosecutors alleged Saucedo targeted victims after dark, shooting them as they stood outside their homes or sat in cars. The violence began on August 16, 2015, with a man named Raul Romero. Romero was 61 years old and had a relationship with Saucedo's mother. He was found shot near his car in the gravel parking lot of his home. Police investigated the killing, but at the time treated it as a standalone case. There was no reason yet to suspect it was the beginning of something much larger. Saucedo struck again about 4 months later on New Year's Day of 2016, killing 22-year-old Jesse Olivas, who was standing outside a home. Then came the stretch that would come to define the case. From March of 2016 through July, a woman and her 12-year-old daughter were among those shot dead as the attacks intensified in frequency and reach. In all, Phoenix police fielded over 3,300 tips from the community as the city tried to make sense of what was happening. Fear had settled into Maryvale at a cellular level. People stopped letting children play outside after dark. Neighbors who had known each other for years now hesitated at their own front doors. Police say there were shootings in which a man and his 4-year-old nephew were targeted but escaped without physical harm. A detail that, when absorbed fully, says everything about how indiscriminate the pattern truly was. What makes the Saucedo case particularly striking from an investigative standpoint is a detail that emerged only after his arrest. There had been a window, brief but real, in which the case might have been interrupted. In September of 2015, a weapon linked to the Romero killing was among several guns seized from Phoenix area pawn shops as investigators worked a separate freeway shooting case. But because analysts found what appeared to be a match for their freeway suspect among the first 4 weapons tested, they stopped there and returned the remaining guns, including the one linked to Saucedo, to the pawn shop without further examination. That weapon was later sold to a new owner. By the time detectives retrieved it and completed ballistics testing, 9 people were already gone. The shootings ended abruptly in July of 2016 following a massive public awareness effort, and investigators later learned that Saucedo had changed his appearance and stopped driving his BMW around that same time. It was a deliberate shift, suggesting he was paying attention to what police were releasing to the media. In at least 2 instances, he had reportedly yelled at his victims before shooting, a signature detail that investigators noted as part of his pattern. The breakthrough came in April of 2017 when Saucedo was arrested in connection with the Romero killing. A 9mm high-point pistol owned by Saucedo was confirmed by ballistics experts to be the same weapon that had killed Romero, and he was additionally identified in a lineup by a surviving victim of the series. On May 8, 2017, Phoenix Police Chief Jerry Williams stood before cameras and confirmed what many had feared. Saucedo was linked to 9 murders and 12 incidents in total, 3 more attacks and 2 more deaths than investigators had originally attributed to the pattern. Saucedo pleaded not guilty to all charges. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office is seeking the death penalty, which, if imposed upon conviction, would tie him as the most prolific serial killer in Arizona history, matching the 9 victims attributed to the baseline killer. Mark Goudeau, a decade prior. His trial had been scheduled for February of 2025. But due to the sheer complexity of the case, including over 200 witnesses, proceedings have faced repeated delays. For the families, that wait has been its own form of endurance. Nancy Peña, whose twin brother Horacio was shot dead as he returned from work, told reporters, "We're still here. We're still waiting for an ending for it all." And Laura Romero, daughter of the very first victim, described the moment she received the call that a suspect had been found. "I was just in shock," she said. "I was crying. I was so relieved that my dad was finally going to get justice." As of the time of this writing, Aaron Juan Saucedo remains in Maricopa County Jail awaiting trial. The trial has been delayed multiple times due to the complexity of the case and the number of witnesses involved. The prosecution is seeking the death penalty. If convicted and sentenced to death, Saucedo would tie as the most prolific serial killer in Arizona history. The families continue to wait for a trial that has now been postponed for years beyond its original scheduled date. 9 people, 12 shootings, 1 man who drove a city bus by day and, by night, prosecutors say, drove something darker through the streets of West Phoenix. The trial continues to make its way through the courts. The families continue to wait. And Maryvale, the neighborhood that bore the weight of all of it, continues to remember those it lost to a year of fear that should never have been allowed to last as long as it did. From the streets of Maryvale, we turn now to a very different kind of case, one that forces us to ask not whether a crime was committed, but whether the evidence used to convict was ever reliable to begin with. This is the story of a father accused of killing his 2-year-old daughter, and of a medical theory that, by the time his execution date arrived, had been all but discredited by the very community that created it. Case number 9. Robert Leslie Robertson III. What would you do if the very science used to put a man on death row turned out to be wrong, not slightly off, not open to debate? Wrong. What would you do if you discovered that a father had spent over 2 decades in a Texas prison cell, watching execution date after execution date get stamped into the calendar, for a crime that, according to some of the world's most respected medical experts, may never have happened at all? And what if the same system that convicted him had been told repeatedly that the ground beneath its case was crumbling, and kept moving forward anyway? This is not a hypothetical. This is the case of Robert Leslie Robertson III. Nikki Curtis was 2 years old. In her short life, she had visited doctors or emergency rooms dozens of times. In the days just before her collapse, she had been to the hospital with respiratory problems and a fever exceeding 104 degrees. She had undiagnosed pneumonia. She had been prescribed codeine and Phenergan, medications now understood to suppress breathing in young children. The jury at Robertson's trial was never told any of this. They were handed a shaken baby syndrome theory presented as ironclad medical fact and told to decide a man's fate. On the morning of January 31st, 2002, Robertson woke to find Nikki unresponsive, her lips already turning blue. He did what any parent would do. He picked her up and rushed her to Palestine Regional Medical Center. Desperate and terrified, he arrived at the emergency room frantic, holding a limp child, begging the staff to help her. Nikki's heart was resuscitated, and she was placed on life support before being transferred to a hospital in Dallas. But by then, doctors believed her brain had already been deprived of oxygen for far too long. A few days later, Nikki Curtis was taken off life support. She was 2 years old. It was the early morning hours of January 2002 in Palestine, Texas, a small, quiet town in Anderson County, about 100 miles southeast of Dallas. Robertson, a man who had custody of his 2-year-old daughter Nikki Curtis, woke to find the child unresponsive. What happened next is where this story takes a turn that raises questions the state of Texas is still struggling to answer. A doctor at the hospital diagnosed Nikki with shaken baby syndrome, a medical theory developed in 1971 by British neurosurgeon Dr. Norman Guthkelch, which held that a specific cluster of symptoms in a child automatically indicated violent abuse. The lead detective on the case, Brian Wharton, accepted that diagnosis. He later admitted he had received no formal training on shaken baby syndrome before the arrest. Robertson was taken into custody before Nikki's autopsy had even been performed. The medical examiner who carried out the autopsy did not review Nikki's full medical history. She did not consult the CT scans that, discovered years later, would show only a single minor impact at the back of Nikki's head, entirely consistent with a fall from a bed. She did not wait for toxicology results that would later reveal toxic levels of Phenergan, a medication prescribed by Nikki's own doctors, still present in the child's system. In 2003, Robertson was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. His own defense attorney did not challenge the shaken baby syndrome diagnosis. He conceded it and argued only that Robertson had momentarily lost control. There was no contest over the science. No one pushed back. This matters enormously because the science was already beginning to unravel. By the time the appeals process was underway, the medical community had already begun distancing itself from the rigid certainty that had characterized the original diagnosis. Research had started showing that the same cluster of symptoms, brain swelling, bleeding in the brain, bleeding behind the retinas, could be produced by short falls, natural illness, and a range of physiological conditions that had nothing to do with abuse. In 2024, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals exonerated a man named Andrew Wayne Rourke, who had been convicted in 2000 in a case built on the same shaken baby theory. The court ruled that the science no longer supported the conviction. Robertson's attorneys argued that the two cases were, in all meaningful ways, identical, and yet, the state of Texas pressed forward. In July of 2024, a new execution date was set for Robert Robertson, October 17, 2024. He would reportedly become the first person in the United States to be put to death for a murder conviction tied specifically to a shaken baby syndrome diagnosis. With his execution less than 2 hours away, 90 minutes by some accounts, a bipartisan group of Texas lawmakers issued a subpoena compelling Robertson to testify before the House Committee on Criminal Jurisprudence. The Texas Supreme Court issued a last-minute stay. The execution did not proceed. It was a reprieve, not an acquittal. A new date was set. October 16, 2025. Days before that date arrived, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued an emergency stay. The case was remanded back to the Anderson County District Court for further review. By February 19, 2025, Robertson's attorneys had filed yet another habeas application, this one supported by a joint statement from 10 independent pathologists who concluded that the 2002 autopsy performed on Nikki Curtis was not reliable. New expert analysis pointed toward disseminated intravascular coagulation, a serious bleeding disorder, as the most plausible explanation for the internal injuries that had originally been attributed to abuse. Brian Wharton, the detective who arrested Robertson that day in 2002, is now a minister. He visits Robertson in prison. He advocates publicly for the conviction to be overturned. One of the jurors who voted to convict and sentence Robertson to death, Tara Compton, published an opinion column in the Houston Chronicle in October 2025, stating she had been wrong. She wrote that had the jury known what she now knows about Nikki's undiagnosed pneumonia, the medications, the signs of sepsis, the deliberations would have gone very differently. She stated she was 100% certain that Robert Robertson did not murder his child. As of the time of this writing, Robert Robertson remains on death row at the Allen B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, his case still under active legal review. He is 58 years old. He has spent over 20 years incarcerated for the death of a child he says he loved. His attorneys, the Innocence Project, a growing coalition of legislators and medical professionals across the country, believe he may be innocent. The state of Texas, led by Attorney General Ken Paxton, continues to pursue a new execution date. The question this case leaves hanging in the air, the question no court ruling can fully quiet, is this: what does it mean for a justice system when the very evidence it used to condemn a man is later called into question by the very community that created it? Robertson has not been exonerated. He has not been freed, but the ground beneath his conviction has shifted in ways that are difficult to ignore. And somewhere in a Texas prison cell, A father who says he did not commit this crime continues to wait. From a case built on science that may have been flawed from the beginning, we turn now to a case built on testimony that prosecutors knew was unreliable at the time they presented it. This is the story of a woman who has spent 27 years on death row, and of a paid informant whose jailhouse testimony put her there, and of a conviction that a federal court finally called what it was: a showcase of prosecutorial misconduct. Case number 10. Brittany Marlowe Hubbard. There is a particular kind of courtroom silence that falls when a jury walks back in to deliver a death sentence on a 23-year-old woman. It is the kind of silence that feels final, the closing of a door with no handle on the inside. But what happens when 27 years later, a federal court cracks that door open again? What happens when judges look back at the trial that sealed her fate and find, beneath the surface of the conviction, that the most damaging testimony used against her came from a woman who was being paid to put her there, and that the prosecution knew it all along and said nothing? That is the question at the center of the Brittany Hubbard case. And it is a question that, as of January 2026, still does not have a final answer. A.B. Towery Sr. was 80 years old. He lived in southwest Amarillo, Texas. On November 13, 1996, he was killed inside his own apartment. According to the prosecution's version of events, the killing had not been an act of self-preservation, but a robbery that turned fatal, that Hubbard had gone there intending to take from him, and that the confrontation was the means, not the cause. Under Texas law, a murder committed during the course of a robbery qualifies as capital murder, which carries the possibility of a death sentence. The physical evidence, the state of the apartment, the money taken, the fact that she had fled, supported their narrative, but their strongest card was a witness. Brittany Marlowe Hubbard was born on January 1, 1973. By the time she was in her early 20s, she was living in Amarillo, Texas, caught in the grip of a crack cocaine dependency that had derailed whatever else her life might have been. Court documents describe her as a bright young woman whose childhood had been marked by severe and repeated abuse and who would turn to sex work to support her addiction. It was not the life anyone chooses. It was the life that had accumulated around her, layer by layer. Over years of pain she had never been given the tools to process. On November 13, 1996, Hubbard was involved in a minor traffic accident while under the influence. She sought refuge in the apartment of A.B. Towery Sr., an 80-year-old man in southwest Amarillo who had been a prior client of hers. What happened inside that apartment that afternoon is something the courts have been disputing for nearly 3 decades. According to Hubbard, Towery discovered her using drugs on his premises and became physically aggressive, striking her twice in the back of the head with a metal pan before reaching for a knife. She says she reacted in fear, believing she had no other options. The altercation escalated. When it was over, Hubbard showered, took approximately $1,400 from his wallet, changed into clean clothes, and left the apartment. She eventually fled to Tennessee, where she was arrested outside a fast food restaurant in Memphis in February 1997. After the television program America's Most Wanted aired segments on the case, she was extradited back to Texas and stood trial in March 1998. Vicki Marie Kirkpatrick was Hubbard's cellmate while she awaited trial. Kirkpatrick told the jury things that no one else could have told them. She claimed that Hubbard had confessed to her in detail, that Hubbard had described the killing as something she found exciting, that she said she would commit a similar act again for drugs, and that the lamp pole had been forced down Towery's throat deliberately because Hubbard was tired of listening to him. It was testimony that did 2 things at once. It dismantled the self-defense claim, and it painted Hubbard as someone likely to pose a future danger, a separate factor that Texas law allows juries to weigh when deciding whether to impose death. The jury convicted. They sentenced her to death. She was 23 years old. What the jury was never told, what prosecutors actively concealed, was that Vicki Kirkpatrick was a paid confidential informant for the Amarillo Police Department. She had worked for the department for months before being placed in Hubbard's cell, had secured roughly 40 search warrants and multiple convictions through her information over the years, and had received thousands of dollars in cash for her cooperation. She was also facing a felony burglary charge at the time. Within 2 days of being placed with Hubbard, she produced the statement prosecutors needed. The same day, the trespass charge against her was dismissed. The felony burglary charge was held over her head until after she testified. Then it too was resolved. Prosecutors presented her to the jury as a disinterested woman who simply wanted to do the right thing. Kirkpatrick recanted everything in 2011. She stated that the then district attorney had threatened her with prison time if she did not cooperate, had coached the substance of her statements, and had pressured her testimony into existence. Despite this, both a Texas appellate court and a federal district court declined to find that Hubbard's constitutional rights had been violated. Then in March 2025, a panel of judges at the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit disagreed, calling the case a showcase of prosecutorial misconduct and reversing Hubbard's conviction in a 2-1 decision. The majority found that Kirkpatrick's testimony had been essential to the state's case, providing the only direct evidence of intent to rob and the only basis for arguing that Hubbard presented a future danger, and that concealing her status as a paid informant had denied Hubbard a fair trial. One judge dissented, arguing that the physical evidence alone was sufficient. In July 2025, the full Fifth Circuit agreed to rehear the case. The conviction was reinstated pending that review. On January 21, 2026, 18 judges sat in an en-banc courtroom in New Orleans and heard arguments from both sides. A ruling has not yet been issued. As of the time of this writing, Brittany Hubbard is 52 years old and is held at the Patrick O'Daniel Unit in Gatesville, Texas, the facility that houses the state's women on death row. She has been there for 27 years. Her case now rests in the hands of those 18 judges and in whatever lens they choose to apply to a question that has proven far harder to answer than anyone anticipated in March of 1998. Was the conviction that put her there built on truth, or was it built on a lie that the state knew about and hid? There is a particular kind of courtroom silence that falls when a jury walks back in to deliver a death sentence on a 23-year-old woman. 27 years later, that silence is still echoing, waiting for 18 judges to decide whether it was earned, or whether it was manufactured by a prosecution that knew exactly what it was doing when it put a paid informant on the stand and called her a concerned citizen. 10 cases, 10 names, 10 stories that force us to reckon with questions we would rather not ask. But before we close, there is one more thing worth considering. What connects all of these stories? What thread runs through them that we need to see clearly? When you look at these 10 cases together, a pattern emerges. Not in the crimes themselves, but in the systems that surrounded them. Rex Heuermann hid in plain sight for 17 years because no one thought to look closely at the architect with the briefcase. Jesse Calhoun walked free because a policy rewarded good behavior without asking what freedom might cost. David Wood's conviction rests on evidence that courts are now questioning 3 decades later. Robert Robertson sits on death row for a diagnosis the medical community no longer supports. What connects these cases is not the violence itself, it is what was overlooked, what was ignored, what was assumed. The women along Interstate 45, the homeless men in Massachusetts, the missing girls of El Paso, the victims in Maryvale. Each case reveals a gap, a failure, a moment when someone should have asked a harder question and did not. Justice is not a machine. It is a series of choices made by human beings. And when those choices are informed by bias, by convenience, by the belief that some lives matter less than others, the consequences are measured in decades, in families waiting, in questions never answered. 10 cases, 73 victims, and countless families still waiting for answers, for justice, for a sense that what was taken from them has been acknowledged. Some of these cases have reached their legal conclusion. Others are still making their way through appeals, through reviews, through courtrooms where judges and juries will decide what the evidence truly means. But every single one of them forces us to ask the same question. How do we build a system that does not just punish, but prevents? That does not just convict, but protects? Because the truth is, these stories are not just about the people who committed these acts. They are about the spaces those people moved through undetected, the red flags that were ignored. The victims whose disappearances did not prompt the same urgency as others. They are about what we choose to see, and what we choose to look away from. As of this writing, some of these individuals await execution, others await trial, some have already been sentenced, and some, like David Wood and Robert Robertson, sit in cells while courts reconsider whether the convictions that put them there can withstand scrutiny. The work of justice is slow, it is imperfect, and it does not bring back what was lost. But it is the work we owe to every name on this list, every victim whose life was taken, every family still waiting. This has been the full account of every evil serial killer of 2025 and 2026. May we learn from their stories, and may we never forget the names of those they left behind.